You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, and welcome to this Insights podcast on leveraging human capital analytics before, during, and after COVID-19. I'm Amanda Popila, researcher in human capital at the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Solange Shah, who's a distinguished principal research fellow, and Stella Lupashore, who's a program director for several councils, both with the Conference Board. Both of my guests today have extensive experience in human capital topics, including the topics of today, human capital analytics and the employee experience. So we're going to jump in just a moment, but before we do so, I want to share a little bit of information about what the Conference Board has been up to these past few months. Recently, the human capital team has been focused on how organizations are responding to COVID-19. We've released a series of short pieces with recommendations and implications for human capital professionals through the crisis. They're all collected on our Human Capital Hub at conferenceboard.org. As part of our podcast series, we've got about a podcast a week, and today we're going to talk about implications for human capital analytics. Solange, Stella, and I have released a short piece on this topic, and we'll share more today. We've identified 3 human capital areas where the use of data is critical in decision-making. Those 3 areas are engagement and productivity, health and well-being, and diversity and inclusion. Today, we'll touch upon all 3 of these areas and share some common metrics before COVID-19, how the pandemic has changed how we collect data, and the potential long-term effects that will remain in place after the pandemic. So let's start by talking about why it's important to leverage analytics, especially in times of crisis. Stella and Solange, I know that you both have 2 slightly different viewpoints on this, so I want to hear from both of you on this topic. Stella, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amanda, for having us. And even though before COVID, people analytics was such a hot area and such a in-demand skill and capability, and the HR was beginning to adopt at a rapid pace the insights that analytics could bring, I think it's something that should be considered as a sense and response system, right? You can look at different indicators in your workforce. You can understand the impact on downstream outcomes, be that productivity, be that business outcomes, customer satisfaction, or external brand image of your organization. And the pandemic and the crisis we're undergoing right now brought forward a lot of changes and considerations organizations need to keep in mind when using these measurements. So first of all, we see new types of measurements that organizations have to establish. They're forced, designation of essential employees, immunity test results, underlying conditions, so they can get a better handle of the safety and well-being of the employees. But then we start seeing adaptation of monitoring tools on some cases to use them as a ways to track productivity and making sure there is awareness of the potential for burnout or potential for mental health issues or lowering of the collaboration between teams. On the flip side, some organizations are starting to use it as a surveillance tools, which starts getting into privacy issues and potentially damaging the brand and the engagement level of the employees. Interestingly, there is also another series of considerations we need to keep in mind is the prediction models and all the algorithms that were built based on the historical data before COVID will all now have to be retested and revisited and making sure that we are making the right decisions and using the right assumptions when we use those type of tools and techniques. So it's a lot of interesting evolution that COVID brought to us, but more importantly, it created an opportunity and a lot more data as people move to work remotely in a distributed fashion and using a lot more technologies. And a lot of that data can help us make better decisions as HR professionals.
Thanks, Stella. And Solange, I know one of your areas of expertise are the financial investments and returns on human capital areas. So can you talk a little bit from your perspective on why using data is important?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having us on. We really appreciate the opportunity to address these really important issues. Your question really focused on leveraging human capital analytics as a way to enhance decision making in organizations. My point of view is that we are using data in every other area of the business process and the business model. And it's time to start using human capital analytics as a way of informing decisions related to the impact, the collective impact of human capital, and understanding the return on investments that we're getting on our human capital investments. So human capital analytics provides some insights that we can reliably use because they're going to be evidence-based rather than using a subjective viewpoint or a subjective measure of whether or not we think something works or something doesn't work. And that's a big departure from the way that we typically do things, or we've traditionally done things in HR. HR requires that we use our gut and our compassion and our understanding of human nature as an input to making decisions. And that's all really good, but we've done so pretty much with the absence of using data to inform those decisions or those insights. And that's why leveraging human capital analytics is going to be so important, especially moving forward. For example, you wouldn't buy a house without understanding the underlying quality of that house that you're about to buy. You'd get a surveyor to come and give you a report. You'd look at its, provenance, its history in terms of, how it's weathered storms. You talk to a financial person to understand what the financial impact will be for you. So buying a house solely on the way the house looks or the way the house feels is not a really smart way of making that decision. And it's the same thing in terms of making human capital decisions. We need to inform those decisions by looking at data and looking at data differently.
Yeah, so on that point, let's dig a little bit deeper into one of the areas. And I mentioned in the beginning, we've got 3 topics in this report and that we'll cover today on the podcast as well. And the first one is employee engagement and productivity. So as we think about why we measure productivity and how we use data to do so, can you share a little bit more about how organizations have been doing this before the pandemic and how things might be changing a little bit during COVID-19?
Right. So before COVID, I think that certain organizations and certain human capital practitioners were actually looking at the efficiency of the programs that they were running in their organizations. So they were trying to understand, are we getting a return on investment in training or in recruitment or in retention or in mobility? And I think the focus was primarily on the efficiencies of those specific programs. Are they doing what we expect them to do? I think what's happening with COVID is there's an exceptionally higher level of sensitivity about people, deploying people in the workforce, and the impact that it has on organizational outcomes or financial outcomes. I think we are now beginning to see how critical workforce and labor is as part of the business model. And I hope that the focus is going to shift, not just from are our programs doing what we want them to do, but is the totality of the way that we deploy, we manage, we train, we mentor, we move, we promote, we pay employees, having an impact on bottom line performance. And so I think it ushers in a whole new focus on different types of metrics. So we don't necessarily need to understand whether or not we have 97% of our employee population participating in the performance management program, or we've got 75% of our employees going through training every year. I think what we need to understand is when we invest $1 in training, are we getting a return on that investment in either higher levels of productivity or longer tenure or higher rates of internal mobility because our employees are better trained and better skilled and more engaged to want to stay with us. And basically connecting the idea between human capital efficiency and corporate financial performance. This is going to be a big topic as human capital becomes a greater area of attention for corporate governance as an ESG issue. And also from a financial perspective, are we actually experiencing a return on investment in every dollar that we spend on people and people programs?
Yeah, thank you. And you started to get here a little bit, but I want to focus on how I mean, we talked about how things are changing before, but what are the impacts that COVID-19 is having on how we measure engagement and productivity, and how some of these changes might be here to stay? So can you comment a little bit on kind of what's changing now and what's going to continue in the future because of the pandemic?
Right. So I think COVID-19 has had sort of a mixed bag impact on different industry sectors. So we've seen some industry sectors really get clobbered by COVID. And we've seen other industry sectors really benefit from COVID with higher levels of revenue and higher levels of employee productivity. So I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that not all industries and all organizations are going to have the same outcomes or the same results based on COVID. But some of the things we know will probably have a long-lasting effect. One of them is work from home or remote work or distributed workforce. We've now proven out that working from home can be as beneficial for a company and for employees as being co-located. And I think we still need to think about how that works, because certain jobs can't be remote, certain jobs have to be co-located, but it gives us some place to look to rejigger the business model, or at least rejigger our thinking about the unit of input, labor as an input to the business model. What we do know is that employees have been transformed to a work from home or a remote workforce. They're reporting that they work longer hours. They have more meetings. They have to deal with many more emails. And they're having difficulty separating work from home, which is so natural. When you leave in the morning and you come back at night, you have a clear distinction. And I think we're beginning to see some issues around burnout. So even though organizations may say, oh, I'm getting higher levels of productivity out of my workforce because they are working longer hours and they are processing more work, we have to look at whether or not that's sustainable. And short-term wins could be long-term losses. And organizations need to think about how to calibrate that moving forward as part of their human resources strategy. Stella's got some great, observations and ideas about this.
Right. So when you look at different levels of productivity, there were research published recently by Workalytics on the impact of COVID on people who work remotely. And for those of you who are interested, we can share more details about this report in our publication when it comes out. However, what we're seeing is the increase at the onset of crisis, the increase in collaboration and communication and engagement level, and then over time subsiding and going down. There is another interesting trend where you see the communication between layers in the organization getting fewer and far in between, which means people are really focusing on getting the work done with their peers as opposed to communicating and engaging with the people in other parts of the hierarchy, which may impact downstream the ability for people to have exposure to the right levels in the organization or come up with new ideas as people previously were enabled when they would have that water cooler or the serendipity of conversations and encounters in the office enabled by the office. The work and the email that is being sent outside the working hours is also on a rise, and that obviously is evidence of the fact that people have child and caretaking responsibility during the day. They have to deal with health conditions, and they inevitably spill their work outside of their typical traditional working hours. And that reality of, oh my gosh, we're in this for long haul, I think is starting to set in, and people are getting tired and fatigued, and that adrenaline is running out. And as a result, the productivity gains that we've seen are going to go on the decline unless we find other ways to enable the workforce to be productive during the day, or other ways to collaborate asynchronously instead of only having meetings and therefore being on all the time.
Another interesting phenomena that we're seeing because of COVID is we went from the lowest unemployment rate in the history of this country right before COVID to the highest unemployment rate that we've seen. We talked about pre-COVID low unemployment rates as the war for talent, right? Organizations were basically at war with one another to bring talent into the organization. With the high unemployment rate, I think there's a temporary ceasefire in the war. But I think we're going to see a lot of employees who are currently unemployed or furloughed either not go back to their old organizations or rethink their relationship to work and the kind of work they want to do. So for companies that are in recruiting mode now, and I know that not all companies are in recruiting mode. I mean, we're seeing big companies lay off staff. We're seeing other companies trying to hire en masse. So it's different for different sectors. But I think this is an opportunity for organizations to find new talent, maybe even better talent, maybe even more engaged talent, because people are going to look for jobs in organizations and types of work that will, get them engaged. And it's an opportunity for the organization to actually change the way they engage with employees and they engage with candidates. So maybe it's a time to reset. Maybe it's a time to say, oh, all those things that I did in the past that weren't working, here's an opportunity to change that and revamp the way that we do things. And of course, my perspective is you want to use data analytics to compare the old way to the new way and try to predict what's going to actually drive economic value creation in your organization.
Absolutely. I think, when we talk about productivity changes, and I know you're saying comparing pre-COVID information to what we might change after. And I think that's really important because when we look at what's happening now, and we talked about some of the productivity changes, people are working longer hours, we were seeing there's more meetings happening and just different ways of working right now. And we have to keep that in mind, that what's happening right now is not going to continue. We're not going to be able to keep up exactly what's going on right now, and that's probably for the best. So I think it's looking at what happened before, look at what's happening now, and using that to kind of shape the future, but keeping in mind that things will change.
And this concept of human capital ROI, the money that we spend on employees need to drive some type of value creation, is really important. And because human capital tends to be the single largest line item expense of an organization, this is a great opportunity to refocus how you're spending money, where you're spending money, and on what you're spending money. This topic has been studied in the academic world for more than 40 years. And there is no doubt that there is a relationship between human capital efficiency and corporate financial performance. And the small changes in human capital ROI, or the return on investment in human capital, can generate large improvements, big improvements in EBITDA. In fact, Hewlett did a study and found that a 10% improvement in HCROI can generate about 40% improvement in EBITDA. So if your organization is focused on performance, looking at human capital and how you can make that more effective, more efficient, and more supportive of productivity is a great place to look.
Thank you. I think we're going to take a short break right now. We'll have some quick break, and then we'll be back in just a minute to continue the conversation. And in the second half, we want to cover the second two topics, the health and well-being and diversity and inclusion measures. that are happening during and will continue after the pandemic.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, we're back on this Insights podcast. We've been talking about how organizations can adapt their human capital practices during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly as it relates to measures of human capital analytics. So the next area that we're going to talk about on this podcast today is health and well-being. The crisis has really affected the health and well-being of employees, and it's drawn attention of businesses and employers on why it's important to focus on this. Well, I'll briefly talk a little bit about what's happened in this space, what's changed, and some of the trends that we're seeing during the pandemic. So before COVID-19, as many of us know, there were corporate health and well-being programs. Many were focused on physical health. In recent years, we saw a little bit of a shift, some employers focusing on other aspects of health or even a holistic approach to health and well-being, seeing more programs around mental, emotional, spiritual, even financial health of employees. And we're expecting that trend to continue. We're actually seeing a huge uptick in some of these areas during the pandemic, and it makes sense. It's things that employees really need right now. So the first kind of trend that we're seeing is a wider variety of health and well-being tools and offerings, both that employers are offering to their employees and also that employees are finding on their own and bringing to their employers. So some examples, many apps that are focused on mental health and coaching, like Better You and Bravely. There are the physical fitness and health apps that we're seeing more and more usage of, things like 7-Minute Workout. And then we're seeing meditation apps, Headspace, being used even more than they were in the past. So these tools are providing benefits for employees, and employers are seeing the benefits as well. The second trend that I want to highlight within health and well-being is not only an increase in new tools and technologies, but also an increase of use of some of the more traditional tools like the Employee Assistance Program, just an uptick in general of the tools and practices that employers offer. So another is telemedicine. Was not as widely used before. I saw a statistic. It's being used by 40, I think it was something like 45% of visits right now during the pandemic are telemedicine visits. So it's really increasing in usage, and it's showing employers the need to have these offerings in the future. And then finally, I do want to mention the blurring of work-life boundaries. Solange mentioned this a little bit in the productivity discussion as well, how we're working more hours, productivity might be increasing, but the likelihood of burnout and some of the tolls that this is taking on employees is also increasing. So the impact is likely to actually decrease our productivity, may lead to greater attrition risks in the future, depending on how long this lasts. So employers will continue to track some of these metrics. We'll see as there are more flexible and remote work arrangements. These are things that employers will track and make use of in the future. And one example that we have in our report is Facebook, who they're doing a lot for their employees around COVID-19, but they're looking specifically to prevent burnout in their employee base. So they're offering flexibility. They have childcare offerings, other things that they're doing just to ensure that their employees don't burn out at this time. So that's a little bit about what we're covering in the health and well-being space in the report. And I don't know, Stella or Solange, if you have anything that you'd like to add before we move on to the last section. Okay. Then I think we can talk about diversity and inclusion metrics. Stella, can you get us started on some of the things that we were looking at? I know we talked about with this research a lot about the different worker segments that are being affected by COVID, what it means for organizations. Can you start us off with what are some of those segments and what are some of the effects?
Absolutely. And what's interesting is when we started writing this piece, we were just dealing with COVID. And I know the word just sounds limiting because that's such a big catalyzer and accelerant for a lot of changes and a lot of negative impact on the health and the economy. In addition to that, we've seen the events of the past couple of weeks with the movement for social justice, which brought the topic of D&I to the forefront in a major way. So if you think about the economic and political and health impact of all of these that are happening in the country, we are seeing a very different disproportionate impact on different segments. And if we look at the history, right, the outbreaks usually give rise to different stigma, blame, xenophobia, discrimination towards demographic segments. And, Latinx were blamed for swine flu, the LGBTQ for AIDS, African American for Ebola. And now that COVID-19 has expanded the list of segments that are being associated or blamed or experiencing aggression. For example, Asian people who are now being blamed for the COVID. But that's just the beginning. The COVID-19 affected populations disproportionately. Let's start with older workers, right? Older workers are physically more likely to be shunned and socially isolated, and they're more likely to experience layoffs. They will also more likely have pre-existing conditions and comorbidity. And there was a recent study done by a couple of professors at the University of Chicago that looked at the transition to work from home, what types of jobs can be done from home. And what they noticed is that a quarter of the full-time employees work from home at least sometimes before the pandemic. However, almost 40% of those jobs could be done from home, right? A smaller percentage of older workers have been able to convert to telework, and about 40% of the 25 to 34-year-olds age group have turned to telework, but only 30% of the 65 plus workers did. And if you look at the history, right, half of the people between 25 and 34 who lost their jobs during last recessions were reemployed within 6 months after that. However, it took 9 months or more on average for the employees of 51 to 60 to gain employment. So we may potentially see a similar type of impact on the ability to stay employed and have financial security for older workers. Another segment is low wage earners, right? Women, people of color, immigrants are overrepresented in low wage and hourly jobs, and they're also at a higher risk of being let go. The economic impact of the pandemic will really have long-term and far-reaching effects, and most likely than not will impact less educated workers, women, and minorities disproportionately. They are also at higher risk of being exposed to the COVID and infection because they more likely will be in essential or frontline occupations. Another category, caregivers. Schools have been closed. People are getting sick and requiring more caretaking. Most likely than not, women and single parents will take the brunt of that caretaking responsibility, and they will try to balance both work and family responsibility, or you may have to step out of the workforce as a result. Workers who contract COVID-19, those people who are testing positive for the virus, they will emerge from quarantine as stigmatized and more likely to be avoided. On a flip side, they will, if they have recovered, they will potentially possess the immunity and might be labeled differently based on this status, contributing to a new divide for those who haves and have-nots. Younger workers are especially graduates, and Amanda, you are amongst them. You are not able now to participate in these major transitional experiences, such as graduating from a college, graduating from a high school. And the negative part is that the labor market is so dismal and so decimated that it provides little stability. And as we have seen in past crises, younger workers, particularly in low-wage jobs, they will more likely to experience job loss, as well as more likely to never be able to catch up in terms of their financial gains and progression of their wealth. Last is workers with poor mental health. The number of people who experience mental health issues is rapidly growing. Some of it is amplified by fatigue or long hours, or they're experiencing grief related to the loss of close ones, or even simply the loss of normalcy and just generalized anxiety we're experiencing as a society. And I think what's interesting to summarize this is individuals who have the ability, the means, the vocation to work remotely are now emerging as a greatly privileged population. And that digital divide that we were so concerned about before COVID is becoming even a bigger accelerant of transitioning to that digital reality. And the disparities that we see between digitally fluent and those who are not necessarily as comfortable with technologies, it is now giving shape to a new digitally affluent class. And the employers really must pay close attention to all of these emerging signs of division and disparities between different classes and people with different abilities and access levels and health conditions. And it's really critical to help people balance their work and life demands, given the circumstances we're all dealing with and probably will deal for the foreseeable future. And the pandemic and the movement, the social justice movement, may provide us with an opportunity to really assess the implications and minimize the impact for these affected populations.
And that's a perfect opportunity to reinforce that we need to use analytics to understand what's going on in our demographics, because using your own powers of observation is not going to generate reliable and valid observations or results. We have biases, and we're even blind to our own biases. And I think that's why we are seeing this cry for removal of systemic and systematic discrimination, because it's built in. And only by using data analytics and getting to the truth of the data are we in a position where we can, as they say, admit where we went wrong and do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of it is we're just starting to see the surface. There are so many populations that have been affected in different ways, and I don't think we've even seen them all. So thanks for walking us through that. And I do think, as a recent graduate, I just got my graduate degree, and we didn't get to go through all of the normal end of the year and kind of ceremonies that you typically would. And I think that could be a whole nother webcast on how the higher education is changing and all of the downstream effects that this will have on younger workers and recent grads. So I want to end the podcast today with some final implications, and I want to hear from both of you, Stella and Solange, on what you would recommend to leaders and employers as they think about measuring human capital information and what they're experiencing right now. So Solange, can we start with you? What are your final recommendations?
Sure. I think it's really important to take a bullseye approach. So look at the big picture first. Look at the biggest impact that human capital has on organization performance. So look at it from a financial perspective, and that will give you cues where to dig down into the numbers or to dig down into the programs to see where there is a high relationship between program effectiveness and economic value creation. Think carefully about the measurements. Think very carefully about how you interpret your results, and that you can validate the information that you're getting from your data analytics. So don't rush, take your time and be thoughtful about or mindful about how you're viewing your organization from a macroeconomic perspective.
And I'll add on top of that, I think in the rush of quantifying everything around us, and now that we have so much more data to look at and make decisions on, it's very tempting to say, "Ooh, let's." We see a decline in utilization of the space. Well, let's shut down the space. Maybe we don't need as much. We can save costs, or people want to work from home. Maybe as a result, we can cut their salaries just because they don't have the commute or they don't have additional expenses related to coming into an office. And I think coming at this, it's a really human crisis with a financial approach alone and thinking of how to maximize revenue or impact the bottom line. It's probably a really short-sighted approach. It's now more than ever, people are paying attention on how the tone at the top is shaping up, how companies make decisions, and they will show their loyalty and their engagement and the productivity and talent by staying or leaving. And yes, the labor market is not helping. However, what goes down goes up eventually. And I think good talent, especially for organizations that have to preserve and maintain their operations, will make decisions based on how the organizations react now. So I think more importantly than ever is not to judge purely on the numbers and analytics, but also bring your heart and make the right choices for the humans in this equation.
Thank you. So Stella, Solange, thank you for being with me today, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in today to this conversation. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our Insights podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website, conferenceboard.org/podcasts. This is Amanda Popila from the Conference Board. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Insights. We hope you'll join us again next week.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.